Historic Parkland House. I'm Shelley Hazer. I'm the director of the Lifelong Learning Program here at Blackbird College. And I am thrilled to welcome everybody here this evening. Those of you who are new, welcome. Those of you that are returning for our speaker series, I'm glad to see you here. So tonight, I just want to say a few things about lifelong learning and Blackbird College. If you picked up this flyer, there is a Keenan lecture Thursday with the history program. This is a first come, first seated, so there's no registration for lifelong learning. And it is with Professor Stephen Petrus, Director of Public History Programs of LaGuardia and Wagner Archives. And his talk will be on Where Have All the Protest Songs Gone by Bob Dylan, the Civil Rights Movement, and a Complete Unknown. So join us. Lifelong Learning will have a reception. It's the same schedule as tonight, 6:30 to 7th reception, and then the speakers from 7 to 8. So you can pick up a flyer if you want. Please join us. And then the second thing is lifelong learning. We'll be going to Lisbon, Portugal. Dr. Nick Miller will be leading that trip December 5th to the 12th. So if you're interested, registration for that is going to be going out April 1st. And he led a lifelong learning trip last year to Portugal. That was phenomenal. It was a huge success. He's got ties to Portugal. I'll probably tell you a little bit about that. And the last is tonight is talk is based on his book. This is his book. So if you're interested, the soft copy, the softback is available at SUNY Press, and he has left codes for a 30% discount if anyone's interested on the table where you came in. So if you are interested in purchasing the book, you can get 30% off with his author code. So this is part of this is based on his research and the class he's teaching at Flagler Lifelong Learning, and some of his lifelong learning students are here this evening. So yeah, that was kind of a long, some people are clapping. That's great. So with that, I know that's kind of a long, winded welcome. I'm going to ask Nicole Diem to come up to the podium and formally introduce Dr. Nick Miller. This is a joint event with Lifelong Learning and the St. Augustine Historical Society, and this is our second speaker of the series this semester. So thank you. Paul?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nicole Dean, the head librarian and curator for the St. Augustine Historical Society. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Nicholas B. Miller. He's a historian of political thought and governance in 18th and 19th century Europe and of the formation of plantation regimes in the wider world. He holds a PhD in history from Universitat Potsdam, summa cum laude, and MS in history from Oxford University, and a BA in history from Durham University. Miller is the author of John Miller and the Scottish Enlightenment, Family Life and World History. He edited collections including Cameralism and the Enlightenment, Happiness, Governance, and Reform in Transnational Perspective, and Plantation Knowledge, Agricultural Colonization, Exploitation, and Exchange since 1500. His research has also appeared in Labour International History Review and edited volumes published by Oxford, Edinburgh, Routledge, and Palgrave. His research has been supported by the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions, the European Research Council, and Fritz Thyssen Foundation. He previously held research appointments at the universities of Plum, Göttingen, and Lisbon, and has been a visiting scholar at the universities of Würzburg, Erfurt, and Hawaii at the East-West Center. Please give a warm welcome to Nicholas Miller.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Also, thank you to the St. Augustine Historical Society, as well as Lifelong Learning, for this kind invitation. I see the opportunity tonight to speak about the plantations of Northeast Florida and global perspective with all of you as a type of privilege, given that I'm not a specialist of colonial Florida. Can you hear me now? Okay, very good. Nice and close to the mic. So, as has already been mentioned, the idea of the content of tonight is linked with my recently published volume with the State University of New York Press, which just came out. In addition, of course, to the flyers around, here you can have it on the screen. If you use this coupon code, you can purchase this book if it sounds of any interest to you after this evening. The hard copy is rather expensive. The paperback is around $35. So with that 30% off, it's, I think, a reasonable amount. Additionally, you don't actually have to buy it. It is available open access online by the press, in part because it's, we thought with this topic focusing on plantations in global history, it's significant to make the research on this open to a broader public, not just in the United States, but around the world, given that many countries that have had plantations are, in what's called the global south. These countries might not have access to, academic libraries to the same extent as here in the States. And so it's also available globally for free online as a PDF as well as an ebook. So as I mentioned, I'm not a historian of Florida, but I'm a global historian of plantations as well as political thought, who happens now to work in Florida. I have been fascinated as a non-specialist to learn about elements of local history over the past 6 years. My specialties fell into two broad areas. First, the European Enlightenment, especially Scotland, though also in relationship to Spain and Portugal. And second, a second field of research relates to plantation complex in the Kingdom of Hawaii, the formation of a plantation complex there before U.S. rule. I think somewhat to my surprise, I've actually seen some parallels between these two fields to colonial Florida. And those are which I would like to share with you. I've seen ways in which colonial Florida compares, connects, and rhymes with themes in both 18th century Europe and 19th century Hawaii. My goal tonight is not so much to add sort of a new research, a new detail on the research level to the history of St. Augustine, as many of those associated with the St. Augustine Historical Society have already done that work, and they know these details better than I do. But instead, I would like to use our talk tonight as an occasion to locate colonial Florida in a global perspective, focusing especially on the period from the 1760s into the 1830s. Generally known in Florida history as the British period, the Second Spanish period, and then the U.S. territorial period. Let's now move to the sort of a map of the cases that I cover in the plantation knowledge volume. So as you see here, they cover cases as diverse as Ireland, which maybe you weren't expecting. Mississippi, okay, in a volume on plantations, yeah, you would expect that. Maybe Ireland not. But the goal of this volume is to study the development of plantations as a form from early modern Europe, that's 15th century, 16th century, 17th century Europe, into the modern world. And significantly, and this is where the political thought element gets into the plantation complex stuff. Plantations originally actually referred to projects for colonization in Ireland. English colonization of Ireland involved, intentional population campaigns, moving people off land, putting newcomers on new land, justifying this as a way of bringing that land to higher utility. And so that's actually the origins, if you want, of the plantation as a concept. Now, the plantations that we know from colonial Florida and the plantations we know, we're sitting in one, right? This was a citrus plantation in the mid-19th century. Of course, have very different characteristics to that. But in this volume, our goal is to actually understand plantations in global history in their various forms. And that constitutes the novelty of this volume. So here, we have cases from Brazil to Mexico to Cuba to Mississippi, Hawaii, Southeast Asia, Africa, and even Europe. And then now, we can think of this event tonight as adding the star there to Florida, to also integrate it within the framework of the plantation knowledge volume. The first part I'll talk about today is definition, right? What exactly is a plantation? Okay, I've already mentioned this weird Irish base, but how do we define this concept? That's a key part of the historical analysis that goes beyond a specific location, right? We have to have definitions that work to understand something in many different cases. And I think here it's interesting to think through that also in the case of Florida. We'll then move to discuss politics, and as I see the interesting and key challenge of studying plantations between the 1760s and 1820s in Florida, in that we have these change of flags frequently, and oftentimes the way that we understand this past is, so there's a Spanish slavery, there's a British slavery, but it's actually a very narrow period of time. Many people are the same. So what are the problems with actually thinking about how plantations work in terms of the ruling government, rather than looking at actually what's happening on the ground? And then finally, and in the third section, I'll turn to what I'm calling projects here. And in this phase, I'll focus on three plantations in particular in Northeast Florida. The first will be Andrew Turbell's project in New Smyrna, which is famous for its connection with the Minorcan migration. The second project, that of Hernandez, actually Minorcan descendant, who established plantations along the St. Johns River during the Second Spanish period. And then finally, Zephaniah Kingsley, who owned the largest plantation network in the Second Spanish period, but as his name reveals, he's actually Anglo-American, and had a very unusual past. So let's get started now with some definitions of a plantation. So what is a plantation and what is its connections with colonialism, right? Even with that Irish case I've given you there, clearly the two are linked, and they're linked in ways that change over time. The way that we have defined this in our volume that I co-wrote with Ulrika, co-edited, with Ulrika Littner, who's a professor of colonialism at the University of Cologne in Germany, is we define that in the following way. Plantations are large-scale agricultural estates that produce select crop commodities in mass using hierarchical, frequently exploitative labor arrangements for consumption in markets beyond the immediate locality. Plants and laborers are often brought in from other regions, inducing environmental impacts and social change, and the use of natural resources, particularly soil and water, is intensive and usually unsustainable. Beyond these core elements, definitions vary through their incorporation of historical or regional particularities, whether implicitly or explicitly. That plantations are necessarily a capitalist form of production is undercut by their persistence in state socialist regimes, such as in Cuba to this day. That they are strictly Western is contested by the proliferation after the end of Western empires, and as well as after post-colonial independence. We have plantations all over the world today. There are oil palm plantations across the independent global south, from Indonesia to Nigeria. That they require slavery, clearly refuted by the fact that plantations still exist today, and they flourished after the abolition of slavery. That they depend invariably on racialized labor arrangements complicated by instances around the globe where plantations actually have featured co-ethnic operation, meaning that, let's say, the planter class and then the worker class of plantations were sort of the same ethnicity. This is very clear in the case of Chinese-run plantations in Southeast Asia. And additionally, we can also say that the fact that plantations are modern can also be challenged because it seems that there are similar instances before modern times, whether that's in the Roman Empire, such as the latifundia, or the cultivation of sugar in both the medieval Islamic world as well as after the Crusades in the Christian Mediterranean. And so, what we argue in this book is that key to understanding how the plantation endures over time is to recognize it in its many and at times unfamiliar forms. And so our goal in this volume was to go beyond a focus on American plantations, important as they are, to incorporate the variety of forms that plantations have taken throughout world history. Now, thinking of the specificity of Florida plantations and their development prior to Florida being part of the United States, I think it's really interesting to think about a definition that was first offered over 100 years ago by a scholar named Edgar T. Thompson at the University of Chicago in his dissertation on plantations, which was the first state academic study of plantations as a sort of historical, formation. And here he really focused on plantations as frontier sites of colonization. And his definition was that the plantation is an incident in the conquest, settlement, and exploitation, politically and commercially, of an invaded country. It is an incident, if not the origin, at least in the expansion of the state, that is, of the territorial organization of society. The plantation arises in areas of open resources as a means of controlling settlement, of preventing the dispersion of labor energy, and of concentrating it in the exploitation of the resources through the medium of a staple agricultural crop. I think you used the term exploitation a few times here. We use it in our definition. I think that's really key to understanding plantations. These are defined by labor exploitations, but also environmental exploitation. Thinking about, however, part of Thompson's definition absent from our definition, which is this focus on conquest and specifically in invaded countries. I think here he did register a significant feature of plantations in their expansion amidst European colonization, which is the populationist component around the establishment of plantations, right? The goal in most cases was to establish a sufficient laboring population, usually classically the American sense through slavery, but elsewhere there are different labor forms. And even here in Florida, if we think about the Menorcans, right, alternatives to slavery. And this was done to secure two projects, individual wealth generation, as well as the development of taxes and tribute for states or for expanding monarchies. The role of law and government in making plantations possible can't be ignored. Almost never did plantations emerge without some sort of legal and political structure associated with them. Plantation labor requires discipline. Plantations as a structure require land ownership. Export abroad requires commercial networks and trade logistics, right? And in view of that, right, it's key to study how plantations thus are not just isolated sites where people are abused and sugar is grown or crops are grown, but they actually come very closely together with the development of state intervention locally. And historically, this happened in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the framework of European colonial empires. But then afterwards, into the 20th and 21st century, this still occurs without that. Now, if you permit me so here I would like to say, so we focus here on the politics of plantations. A specific intervention of our volume has specifically to go beyond Eurocentrism. And the big question here is how to integrate non-European actors and planters in the story of the rise and the continued existence of plantation complexes. So here I would like to take a sort of brief excursus to my own work in this volume, which focuses on Hawaii. And a chapter of this volume studies the figure of John Adams Kuikini Cummins, who was a Hawaiian planter who owned the largest sugar plantation in Hawaii in the 1880s before the U.S. acquisition of Hawaii in the 1890s. It's important to note that Cummins, as a sort of half Hawaiian, half white planter, was not particularly exceptional. If we're thinking about closer to Florida, in Georgia, you have the case of the Vans of the Cherokee, who owns plantations in North Georgia. You have cases of the Creek having similar institutions. And then also in the 19th century, there were cases of Seminoles having plantation-like structures. And so the plantations, as this way of producing agriculture through forced or compelled labor to generate profit, is something that also exists outside of European imperialism, or alongside or at the margins of this, right? I think the case of Florida in between 1760 and 1820 helps us explore this, not in the sense that the planters are not European, but in that they kind of go against a model of plantations that we have in our mind that is very much shaped by our sort of understanding of the U.S. South from the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. Right? Just to explain what's going on in this image in a bit more depth, both were taken by a Portuguese photographer who came aboard one of the first ships from Madeira in the 1880s, which brought altogether 14,000 Portuguese to Hawaii on indentured labor contracts in the 1870s and 80s. This is a really weird migration pattern. I've written extensively about this, and his name was Gonçalves. She was a photographer. Once he arrives in Hawaii, the king, the king is mesmerized by this. He says, "Aha, you can take photos." And so he leaves a wonderful photographic archive. And this scene on the left is from that. It's a scene of the future Queen of Hawaii, surrounded by some other really significant Hawaiian chiefesses on the grounds of the plantation owned by John Adams Cummins, who you see here on the right. He really enjoyed his delightful beard there. And he's holding kalihis. These are sort of signs of royalty in the Hawaiian tradition over Ruth Pe'elo Kalani, who was a very powerful chiefess of the mid-19th century. And so what I wanted to show here, right, is this isn't just a case of plantations developing in Hawaii despite Hawaiian sovereignty. This is actually plantations growing in Hawaii in sync with Hawaiian sovereigns. The left image I first spotted in the State Archive of Hawaii. I was doing some research there in 2023. It was still kind of strict COVID-y. They had shower curtains dividing the different desks between people, stop the spread. And then I saw this image, and I thought it was so interesting. I was like, what is going on here? And so in the archives there, this is part of the material that describes the Queen Liliuokalani, the final queen of Hawaii. It only was with actual further investigation of this and looking into this that I realized that this was actually taken on a plantation. And so at the archives, there's nothing about that plantation component. But you see here, right, we have the Hawaiian sovereign literally at her kind of close friends, Kuinakina Cummins plantation, where they're enjoying a sort of gathering here. Now, my chapter in the volume that discusses this shows how the plantation is referenced in Hawaiian mele, which are these traditional dance, and how the goal of this plantation was to generate revenue for the monarchy. And I also show what happens to Cummins after the monarchy is overthrown. Okay, but I could talk all day about Hawaii, but let's get back to Florida. So let's get into the realm of politics, which, as you could just see there with my Hawaiian example, right? I'm really interested in how owners of plantations interact with politics, and sometimes in very unpredictable ways. Here's a question about how to write Florida history, right? How to think about Florida history. How should we write the history of a place like Florida, which within a couple generations witnesses a rapid succession of flags, right? You see here in this sort of anachronistic, diagram here, which I got off of a website for teaching Florida history in schools. You have your first Spanish period, followed by your British period, followed by your Spanish period, followed by your American period. That happens here in the course of a couple generations, right? Conventionally, transfers of sovereignty are taken to be transformative, right? when we think about what Florida may have been like during the first Spanish period, we figure that it must have changed fundamentally during the British period. And part of that's because, of course, most of the people in that colonial society left, right? Changes at the flagpole are taken to be transformative, signaling clear ruptures in the political structure, laws, policies, language, and leading personnel and the territory in question, right? And this matters all the more, importantly, in colonial and imperial contexts, where the direction of policy is thought to be profoundly reshaped by the arrival of new administrators from the imperial metropole, and where migration flows are redirected according to the nation or empire, right? Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, why exactly do we assume this to be the case? Conventionally, historians use sources produced by governments. These are usually the densest, they're well maintained, and that's especially true of former European settlements and colonies. Governments produce administrative reports, property surveys, tax records, maps, complaints. They have to field complaints and they come up with some response to them. And they even take out censuses, right? And importantly, not only the forms of those government materials changes on these flags, but so does the language that they're issued in. And yet, I think it's worth bearing in mind and considering the extent to which this evidence, fractured as it is by language, it exaggerates the scale of historical transformation that actually takes place in the site in question. Historians, for reasons of tradition, but also feasibility, are conventionally trained to specialize in the history of one country and the language or languages most pertinent to the historical sources for that country. For sites that were colonies like Florida, scholars usually specialize in one or two fields, right? As specialists of U.S. history, or as specialists of the Spanish Empire. And then a third kind of minority specialization there focuses on the British Empire. The result becomes one where a single place that is part of all these domains within a 60-year period becomes understood as a site to three very different sites of sovereignty, right? And where the scholars who are an expert of one of those empires defer to those on the other to explain these processes. And so, look, this approach to doing this is pragmatic, given all the different expertise, all the different knowledge, all the different funding that would be required to study, Florida's histories in three different empires, the archives pertaining to those. But it also reveals a sort of cleavage that structures how the history is written, researched, and the expertise to do that, right? Now, historians have been alerted to this challenge, right? And here the argument is emphasizing continuities, all right? And here I'd like to make an excursus back to the Pacific, right? Hawaii, for example, is another case of a place that has all these different government formations that change very quickly, right? It's an independent kingdom until 1893. Then it's a republic, it's a white-led republic for a few years, and then it becomes a U.S. territory. This is where people's sort of stripes change, or the politics of their location changes. Cummins, you see here, right? You can always look at the mushroom chops. That's where he is. He goes from being in the 1970s, 1880s, being seen as a rather conservative figure who labor activists despise because he's a planter, to in the 1890s becoming the leader of the movement to restore the Queen to the throne of Hawaii. And so there you have this sudden shift of despised planter by nationalist Hawaiian labor activists to celebrated anti-colonial activists. So it's really quite as you see here, people's location changes. Even the plantation's still there throughout all this, but the way that these people are understood shifts based on the political formation. A second case that was also, I think, instructive and really interesting to think in the case of Florida is the Philippines, which the local specialists will know, right? The British trade the Philippines for Florida after the French and Indian, the French and Indian War. So here you have with scholars who study the Philippines, the notion of imperial transition as a sort of a solution to an older problem, right? In Filipino history, typically you have people who study the Spanish period before 1898 or the American period after that until World War II. But obviously, people lived through this transition. all the same people were doing kind of the same stuff. It would seem that you need to actually focus on sort of an evolution, sort of a gradual change, rather than just thinking, well, okay, everything changes overnight. Clearly doesn't, right? And scholars like Joseph Verdera, Kathy Cruz Gutierrez, others have, Alfred McCoy have focused on that. The critique that I want to make here on the question of politics has to do, I really want to stress the difference between the first and second Spanish period, right? This here seems to give us the impression that what's happening in the second Spanish period is a sort of revival of what was there before. It's back to Spain. But I mean, those vexillologists of you, of course, know this flag is totally anachronistic. I mean, this is the flag after 1785. That's the older Spanish flag. And in fact, the way that Florida is governed during the second Spanish phase is profoundly different than it was during the first Spanish period. And the key change there is the role of plantations. Before the British period, as far as we would understand it today, there are basically not really plantations in Florida. The goal is not to create crops that you can export in mass. When the British come, that's their vision for what they can do in Florida, make it economically productive. And then after the British leave, following U.S. independence, they give it back to Spain. The new Spanish administration is sympathetic to that, but essentially the British precedent there. That aligns with reforms in the Spanish Empire known as the Bourbon Reforms, which focused on economic improvement, as they saw it, in terms of making territories generate more capital. And so my argument here, right, is that we need to sort of think of this, really look at the transitions and really look at the continuities over assuming radical rupture in this history as it pertains to plantations. Now I'd like to move to three projects as I'm defining them. Now, the focus on projects is sort of a historical development in the past, I would say 10 to 15 years in various fields of scholarship. But this essentially suggests that, well, one way to understand the connection between how, let's say, what a plantation looks like. I mean, we can take the different examples of this, and what the people involved with creating it, the people trying to make money through the plantation are doing, is to look at them as projects. Projects aren't always successful. Oftentimes they fail. And then also frequently there's some sort of unusual dimension to them. And emphasizing the sort of spectrum of projects that are plantations is one way in which our volume, plantation knowledge volume, distinguishes from previous work. We emphasize this sort of project making component, right? Now, the figure that is connected with that, okay, on top of projects, there's a strange word called projector. Okay, I don't mean something that shows something on a screen, but this is from early modern studies, and this emphasizes on this kind of strange characters, usually men in this period, who dreamt up big schemes, usually in distant lands, promising, among other things, profit, who succeeded in amassing capital and proceeded to try to implement their weird visions, usually with mixed results. Oftentimes they failed, right? You might know this figure as the adventurer in 19th century, or today, a startup founder, or someone, I just have gotten familiar with this lingo. This is very 2026, the agentic figure, right? The person who makes stuff happen, right? So let's look at our historical agents. And I think, I recognize some of you in the crowd. I'm going to show, three different plantations from the British period into the second Spanish period into the territorial period. And the first is Andrew Turnbull in New Smyrna. We went there last year with Lifelong Learning. Just a few weeks ago, we went to the second plantation. You'll see the Hernandez plantations, just a little down the St. John's River. And then the third one is going to be the Kingsley Plantations, which I think several of you may have gone with Dr. Bryant, my colleague, in the history program. And so let's take a look at this first character, Andrew Turnbull. Now, he was trained at Scottish universities in medicine, and I actually studied these during my PhD way back when in the 2010s. And he made a career for himself decades before he comes to Florida. He sets up shop in what is now Turkey, in a place called Smyrna, now Izmir, and works for the Levant Company, which is a sort of parallel to the East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company. There are these chartered British companies. And he has, once Britain takes Florida, he is well connected with the powers that be in Britain, and he has a great vision. He thinks, aha, in this I could get land there, and I'm going to bring a bunch of people from the Mediterranean, settle them there. I don't need to use slavery; that's unethical. I don't need to engage with racial slavery. I can do something different, and I'm going to grow various crops, namely indigo. There is a ton of stuff written about Turnbull and this kind of disaster, if you will. It's significant because it leads to the migration of Menorcans to Florida. Menorcan it's very unusual, this whole Menorcan migration. First of all, they're not really all from the island of Menorca. They're from all over the Mediterranean. Second, this was actually, the Menorcan migration is the single greatest movement of Europeans in any one campaign, true indenture you haven't heard in all of colonial North America. So it's quite an outlier. And both the fact that they're from the Mediterranean is an outlier, the size is an outlier, the experiment is an outlier. This is all really weird. And this is going to become a type of theme. It's really kind of hard to put these Florida plantations in the long American history of plantations. But I still think that in the global history of plantations, this makes some sense. Work that's been done on Turnbull's experiment, the first work sustained was in 1901 by Carita Doggett. There's dozens of works from public scholars on the plantation on this whole endeavor. But I want to focus on one key element here that maybe you haven't thought of before, which is this thing to the right, which you can see in central New Smyrna today. It's so classically, this was referred to as Turnbull's mansion, right? The evil figure Turnbull who exploited all these Mediterranean people. Of course, it's devastating. More than half the people that arrived died. The conditions were awful. He literally had no idea what the hell he was doing. Let me just put it like that. He had no idea what he was doing. And the Menorcans didn't either. And eventually, they managed to find their freedom, walk up north, settle in St. Augustine with the permission of the British governor, etc. Right? But this structure here, a mansion. I mean, that seems rather unlikely. One theory that's been offered by Matt Eddy at the University of Durham is actually, and yes, that's my alma mater, but I'm in contact with him, and he's originally from Daytona Beach. But his actual argument is that this is very similar to the type of structures that the Levant Company built in the Ottoman Empire to trade goods, because you could defend the goods there, right? Now, in the context of Florida, all this stone, I mean, it makes very little sense. It would flood. I mean, it's unnecessary. But I mean, that's his argument, is that what we're seeing here is not just some mansion. That's what we would assume with like the idea that, okay, every plantation has the nicest thing on it's going to be the plantation house. But rather, his argument is that this is a storage facility that was basically done on the Turkish model, if you will, the Turkish colonial model, rather than anything that was British or Spanish. Let's now move to a second case. Here I just wanted to connect this with one of the chapters from my plantation volume, and here I do this for each of the cases, right? This is what I was referring to earlier, this weird case of the rise of the Irish plantation complex, and this is by Ted McCormick at the University of Pennsylvania. And what he really emphasizes here is this concept of projecting, right? How people came up with strange projects, these ambitious projects, and how that's actually a key part of this history of the plantations. That oftentimes there's this kind of, this isn't just about duplicating what they know works everywhere else. There's actually a part of the creation of a sort of new model that goes along with the spread of plantations. Let's move now to a second case, Joseph Marion Hernandez's plantations along the St. Johns River to our south. He's very different than Kingsley. Not a lot of research by him. There's a good MA thesis by him on him from 2004, but that's it really I've seen. He was born a subject of Spain from Menorcan migrants, right? And so here we see some continuity. Hernandez was not a particularly, wealthy individual, and nothing compared to Kingsley or to Turnbull. But he manages to become a plantation owner of some scale. In the various things written about him, he's often had cast as Minorcan, but also Spanish. And I think that using these labels might distract us to actually a much more complicated character. In his youth, he studies in South Carolina as well as Cuba. And he is, he fights in the army for Spain against, U.S. incursion. Once Florida's American, he is elected as the U.S. territorial representative for Florida. And then he builds up a sort of plantation business, from the Spanish period into the 1820s. In 1835, during the Second Seminole War, he leads the militia, the head commander of the East Florida militia for the U.S. government. This is a really interesting event. In 1835, you have the burning of St. John's Plantations, which sort of brings to an end this sort of plantation sector that I'm arguing kind of develops from the British period and kind of continues into the Spanish period with many common features across them. Another interesting feature of Hernandez is where he chooses to go in the 1840s. He moves to Cuba. That is that element there, moving to Cuba, reflects actually a general trend that happens in that period globally in the 1830s into the 1840s. You're having, after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, the decline of a British plantation sector in the Caribbean, and all these experts that used to be there go to new places, like especially Southeast Asia, to develop new plantation complexes. And this is studied in our volume by Christina Scott from the University of Cambridge on this, on the development of a place called Province Wellesley in Malaya, in what's now Malaysia, near Penang, from that. In that same time period, right? So we can put Hernandez maybe in that kind of context, right? Something changed, and this caused him to move over to a new location. And finally, I would like to consider who I find the strangest character of them all, Zephaniah Kingsley, the British slave trader who dies a Haitian citizen, and who authors a treatise that is pro-slavery. But I think he would think of it also as anti-racist. It makes very little sense, right? It's so weird. All these strange people in this colonial Florida plantation complex. As you'll see here on the right, there is a work, the Treatise on the Patriarchal or Cooperative System of Society, as it exists in some governments and colonies in America and in the United States, under the name of slavery, with its necessity and advantages by an inhabitant of Florida. What is going on here? A patriarchal or cooperative system of society. Well, part of this is a kind of branding that is simultaneously backward-looking as well as forward-looking. The patriarchal component aligns with Kingsley's vision that he was not going to practice, the type of slavery common in the U.S. South. He virulently opposes it, but rather what he imagines to be African slavery. The cooperative system of society is actually in direct dialogue with Robert Owen and this project of reforming labor systems to be less exploitative. All right. Just in the interest of time, I'll make one more point about Kingsley, which is really unusual, right? How does he end up a Haitian citizen? Well, yes, I mean, this is truly bizarre. He has his start in the slave business as a slave trader. He is he's a loyalist. He ends up in Nova Scotia. He then engages in slave trading. He becomes a citizen of of Denmark in the 18th subject, I should say, as monarchy in the 1790s. And then he finds his way somehow in colonial Florida. When Florida becomes part of the U.S., he finds himself at odds with this sort of emerging system from the U.S. North. Why? Well, Kingsley is married, not just, he's married to a woman that he bought as a child slave, not very nice. That's not great. But his children were all mixed race. And his idea was, in this volume, is that he's suggesting that future slavery is to have a mixed race plantation class, owning class. That's very unusual. It's out of sync, totally with the U.S. South. And it seems really weird in the context of U.S. history. But if we expand it outwards, actually, it makes a lot more sense, and it's not as unusual. Now, the fact that Kingsley in the 1830s and 40s gets an invitation from the Haitian government to move to Haiti, bring his enslaved people there, and sort of apply his type of model in a recently conquered area of what's now the Dominican Republic is really unusual. Okay, that's really strange. But again, we see this case of Kingsley, someone who can change spots in various different political contexts. Now, the connection I want to make here from our volume is by Claudia Rusch. She's a postdoc at the University of Konstanz in Germany. And here she wrote a very, very strange paper called Experimental Paternalism in Owenite Plantation in Mississippi. What was this? Well, you can read more in that chapter. Jefferson Davis's brother met with Robert Owen, the social reformer, in the 1820s and proceeded to try to develop a Owenite plantation at Davis Bend. There's a big story to that. Just in the interest of time, we'll sort of move along. But I should say that actually the long-term legacy of that plantation experiment was the community of Mont Bayou in Mississippi, which is one of the longest-lasting utopian colonies, and importantly, African-American utopian colonies. So, yeah, there are these really strange kind of experiments that align with plantations. Good. So here, let's now move to some words of conclusion. So, as I hope to show, the study of plantations in Florida before the 1830s is one that connects across different sovereignty regimes, right? British, Spanish, and America, and it varies also in form as well as in individuals. In my eye, this really stresses continuities in the history of North Florida. I don't really see what is particularly Spanish about that plantation complex of Florida during the Second Spanish period. Further, if we recognize the diverse identities of some of these leading planters at this time, I think we come to a more nuanced understanding of what's going on here. I think that slavery in Florida is a little bit less. I think an easy distinction between Spanish slavery and American slavery is somewhat dubious in this period. Now, things changed considerably in the 1830s from the Second Seminole War, in which a lot of plantations burned down, in part because of indigenous resistance, and many enslaved people sort of joined their ranks. So they sort of bring that complex down to the ground. And then a new complex emerges in its wake that is much more connected with the Deep South and connects Florida, importantly, with the history of all that would follow, including slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the lost cause, et cetera, right? But I think, the key point I want to emphasize here is that colonial Florida is this experimental borderland between the 1760s and the 1820s. Describing this plantation system as Spanish prior to its identification, however, simplifies things. Florida in the late 18th and early 19th century was a minor, the cosmopolitan Atlantic borderlands, the tidewater frontier, to use Paul E. Hoffman's words, whose plantation complex was, as I see it, basically British in origin, and whose fundamental characteristics throughout the Second Spanish period and U.S. territorial period were consonant with the practice of slavery across the wider Caribbean world. Beyond anecdote, there's little evidence to substantiate an argument that the practice of plantation slavery as a system was much different in Florida than, say, contemporary Jamaica, South Korea, or Cuba, South Carolina, or Cuba. As is very well known, like in all other sites across the Americas at this time, slavery had become an experience restricted to those deemed black. We know that the lived condition of slavery was almost always brutal, though subject to individual variation, however, always with the essential characteristic of chattel slavery, the denial of legal personhood. Yet, as is all too often forgotten, freedom during this time had not become an experience exclusively delimited to those deemed white. What makes projects like Kingsley's mixed-race owning family or Turnbull's Mediterranean plantation workers before it so fascinating for us today is the extent to which they are out of sync with our visions of the black-white economy of the Old South. We must, however, remember that this project of racial feudalism and later segregation was never actually completely implemented, right? While increasingly persecuted, there were significant free Black populations across the U.S. South prior to establishment of slavery, and the presence of free Black and mixed race people in Florida prior to statehood, which Kingsley, in sync with practice south of Florida, referred to these groups as free people of color, reflects less a disconnect from the Spanish plantation complex system than it does the retention of an older, less strictly racialized practice of social hierarchy that had been common across the Americas before around 1800. It is perhaps for this latter reason why our two figures, Hernandez and Kingsley, ended their careers and lives with plantation projects in the Caribbean and featuring migration to Cuba and Haiti. Yet, this was no mere dynamic of the Florida plantation complex coming home. Rather, to Spanish America or the Caribbean. Rather, these individuals whose careers and earlier plantation projects have been interconnected with an older British story advanced renewed plantation projects adapted to new opportunities. In Hernandez's case, playing a role in bringing an intensified form of plantation slavery to Cuba, to produce sugar, and in Kingsley's case, a practice of slavery mitigated by African homesteading in the project of Haitian occupation in the Dominican Republic. On a final point, I should note that Hernandez's and Kingsley's careers ended the ways they had begun, to pursue opportunities for self-enrichment through intense and often exploitative agriculture in view of transition to sovereignty. And lest we forget, it was the same dynamic that was likewise embraced by Southern planters who ventured south into Florida during the early territorial period. What links the plantations of North Florida in the period I've described today with those across the world, past and present, with slavery or without it, is this basic factor. The character of plantations as projects for individual or corporate self-enrichment through the production of agricultural commodities, which are adaptable to changing moral and legal regulations regarding labor and in the service of a wide spectrum of political projects. And on that, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was really interesting. And I kept on thinking about Northeast Florida, sort of like the Great Lakes region after the French and Indian War. And I kept on thinking about Richard White's Middle Ground and how the Native Americans themselves were able to really reshape relationships with the various peoples who came through there, from the French, the English, to the Americans. And I wonder what was the agency of the enslaved people when they were enslaved in plantations to change the actual structure? Because you concentrated a lot in your talk on the sort of owners, right? And where they were coming from. But I'm wondering, what about the from the bottom up, so to speak, and what was their role in changing how plantations were structured and operated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think from the perspective of like a sort of the project of a plantation, I don't know of many cases where we have like sort of like former enslaved people like, developing like, appropriating the plantation model. We see that with certain indigenous groups, right, that we've highlighted there. But the question there is, what about the formerly enslaved? I mean, we can kind of see this in two directions, right? The first that would come to mind is the role of what enslaved people choose to do to sort of get out of the plantation, right? Or when opportunities arise. If we're thinking the Second Seminole War, right, and the plantations are burning, a lot of these enslaved people are joining with the Seminole and going into the interior. That said, I mean, then things get a little bit complicated because the Seminoles also are attempting to develop a sort of, I mean, there's a work a couple decades ago on this on so-called plantations. And sometimes these people could kind of get wrapped up in sort of forced agricultural work. So, I mean, they escaped, but then they sort of were put back in the same sort of system, right? I mean, the second way that I think answer that question would be to explore the way in which, maybe not to put it back on the planters, but the way in which the planters have to adapt their practices in view of the reality that, there is always the risk of resistance at a plantation, right? I think Kingsley there is interesting. Because in that treatise, right, that really strangely named treatise, here we'll go back to this. He mentions in his first footnote, and this thing is quite poorly written in the sense that more than half of it's just a bunch of footnotes. Yeah, so you've got to put that in the main text. But here he says, oh, his only motive is profit. But then he also says that he despises the type of slavery that had emerged in the southern states, which he's not considering Florida as part of his territory at this time. So I think there with Kingsley, you're seeing maybe a sort of weird. I do think that we should maybe understand his development of a model in the view of the resistance of enslaved people, because he's somehow trying to come up with a model that he views as sort of benevolent, right, rather than merely exploitative. And so even there, he talks about certain so-called rebellions or resistance movements by enslaved people, and he's like, oh, but they didn't do that for me because they agreed to my cooperative system, right? So yeah, I think those are some ways of maybe going on that. But yeah, thank you very much for your comment. Yeah.
It's a Pula plantation that's out of Palm Coast. You know that one?
What's that?
The Pula plantation at Palm Coast.
The Pula plantation. That's really interesting. I actually have a student in my historical methods course this semester working on that one. The textual records are actually pretty light, and a lot of stuff's archaeological in nature. So he is also an anthropology major, so he's digging into that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see what he comes up with there. But yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, it's burnt down during the Second Seminole War, which it's true of many of the plantations in that area. Yeah, back then.
He was benevolent, I think.
No. But that wouldn't be a patriarchal system. So Kingsley was benevolent if the enslaved people leave the plantation. No.
Was he really different?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good question. The person who's done the most work on Kingsley is Daniel Schaefer up was at UNF for a long time, and he really emphasizes that Kingsley apparently used the task system for slavery, which is okay. I mean, these are models, and I didn't touch upon that in the presentation. These are interesting. There's a shift that occurs in the Americas. The theory is that around in the late 1600s, you have the shift from a task system of slavery, where essentially enslaved people are given tasks to complete. They can complete it, then they have the time to do whatever they want. And then but then there's that shift from that system to a gang labor system, where it's like, well, when are you done working? Whenever the crack of the whip stops. And so that latter system is, of course, it's obviously more exploitative, right? I think that we should make a distinction there that clearly the task system would provide a bit more room for individual autonomy. Also, the other thing to keep in mind is that this latter system of gang labor is really suited for certain crops, particularly sugar, because sugar requires very unique there's unique features of this. The first is, unlike the other crops, you really got to process it locally. And second, it's incredibly sensitive to time. Once you cut the cane, you've got to process that as fast as possible so it doesn't dry up. And so, as you can see what I'm saying there, you have to do everything very quickly. This leads to the expansion of the gang labor system, particularly to grow sugar, right? And so, and that's why, I mean, dynamics of that exist even after slavery ends. If we're thinking in the long 19th century, across Asia, Hawaii, of course, other places, is that the intensity of labor persists even when slavery is over, because sugar has this requires this intense labor in short periods of time, which can revolve, if we're thinking about the cane mill, a 24-hour operation. And so there's sort of industrial characteristics to that. Now, going back to the Kingsley question, it seems that he practiced the task system. If we read this, I mean, in a way, there's a good version of this by the University Press of Florida that I think was called Balancing Evils Judiciously, which I guess reflects Kingsley's perspective on this. I think certainly Kingsley was not the worst practicer of slavery. I mean, for what that's worth. And I think he genuinely thought he was improving. I think he thought genuinely that he was offering an alternative to a bad system in the South, right? But it must be stressed, he is not opposed to slavery. He thinks it's natural, and he thinks it's superior to free labor. And maybe that's one final thing I'll say. And that if you read this thing, it's not that long. It's really weird. He constantly emphasizes that his enslaved people live better than the free white people around him. Okay, whether or not we believe that to be true, well, critical thinking is helpful on that one. Yeah.
What he did was, felt, I guess, surprising for the day, left his plantation to Anna,
Yes.
his wife. I'm surprised you mentioned that. Bit of a folk hero around here in the Northeast. Where did it end up? Like, I know it's open to the public now. Was it like, as it is? What happened with her children? Did they take it over? She ran it for a bit.
Right.
Then what happened?
So eventually the plantation is transferred over to the federal government.
Why?
What's that?
Why?
I mean, I think people who are guardians of like local history here know better than I do. I suspect that, after the Civil War, the thought of the family wasn't to, continue the plantations. One thing I should note, right, plantations don't stay productive forever. Usually, there's few cases of plantations that last for a century. Usually the soil erodes quite terribly, water supplies are going down, more competitive regions are emerging somewhere else, labor costs are increasing, and that's just a global dynamic. So very rarely, the fact that the plantation kind of closes after several decades is not exactly unusual, right? The family, though, become quite a noted, quite noted in Jacksonville, there's that. The Haitian dimension, which is the kind of, I'm really interested in like the mobility of these international connections. The Haitian dynamic is really interesting because many of the enslaved people that were moved there, actually they gain their freedom at base home centers, and then they stay there. And like some of their descendants like continue to speak English in this region of the DR. So it's very, so there's many layers to that, to the King story. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh,